The sun was setting over the wide fields of Samuel's ranch. The sky turned orange and purple, while the shadows stretched long across the dry grass. For years, Samuel had lived alone here, far away from the noise of the cities and the busy trade routes of the galaxy. He was a retired human soldier, strong once but now aged, his hair gray and his back bent. Still he kept his land clean and his animals fed. His days were simple, filled with small tasks, and his nights were filled with silence. He liked the silence, or so he told himself, but often, when the wind howled through the fences, he felt a heavy emptiness inside. His house was large but quiet, with old pictures on the walls and a fire that burned low in the evenings. It was a life of peace, yet also a life of loneliness. No one came here, no one knocked on his door, and Samuel thought it would remain that way until his last day. On this particular night, a storm was building. Dark clouds rolled over the hills and the air was thick with dust. Samuel locked the barn and walked slowly back to his porch. The first drops of rain hit his skin as thunder rumbled in the distance. He poured himself a cup of tea and sat in his old wooden chair, listening to the storm grow. The wind whistled, the shutters creaked, and lightning flashed across the sky. Then he heard something strange. At first he thought it was the storm, but no, the sound was different. It was soft but steady. Like many footsteps moving together, Samuel frowned, his hand tightening on the handle of his cup. Footsteps here on his ranch at night. In the middle of a storm, that was impossible. No one ever came this far. The sound grew louder, closer. Until it reached the front gate, Samuel stood up, his old soldier instincts waking again after years of sleep. He walked to the door and opened it slowly. The rain was falling harder now, splashing against the porch. And there, just beyond the gate, he saw them, 11 figures, cloaked in dark fabric, stood in the rain, their faces hidden under hoods, their shapes tall and slender, not human for a moment. Samuel thought his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. But then one of the figures lifted her head, and he saw glowing silver eyes shining in the dark. They were not human, they were aliens. And there were 11 of them. His heart pounded, his grip tightening on the doorframe. Why had they come here, to his ranch? To his quiet, lonely land? One of them stepped forward, her voice soft and trembling. "Please," she said, her words broken but clear in human tongue. "We need shelter." The others lowered their heads, their cloaks dripping wet, their bodies shaking in the cold rain. Samuel's mind raced. He had seen aliens before. Back in his soldier days, some were friends, some were enemies. And many were strangers who carried their own stories of pain and survival. But never had 11 of them stood at his gate in the middle of the night, begging for safety. Why him, why now? What danger followed them? The storm roared louder, the lightning striking across the hills. The figures did not move, they simply stood, silent, waiting, desperate. Samuel felt the weight of their eyes on him. Something about them stirred a feeling he had not felt in years, a call to protect, a call to help. But he was only one man, an old man at that, and there were 11 of them. His voice was low, rough from years of little use. "Who are you?" he asked, "and why did you come here?" For a moment, there was no answer, only the sound of rain hitting the dirt. Then the first woman spoke again, her silver eyes shining even brighter as she stepped closer to his porch. "We are widows," she whispered, "and we have nowhere else to go." Samuel's breath caught. Widows, 11 of them, seeking shelter on his lonely ranch. His eyes moved from one face to another. Seeing only shadows under their hoods, he felt the air grow heavy, as if the storm itself had paused to listen. This was no ordinary visit, no passing travelers seeking rest. This was something greater, something that would change his life forever. And in that moment, standing on his porch with rain falling and thunder crashing above, Samuel realized his quiet days were over. The silence he had carried for so many years was about to be broken by the 11 alien widows who had come to his door, and by the unknown story that had brought them here. The rain kept falling as Samuel stood frozen on his porch. Before him, the 11 cloaked figures waited, their shoulders shaking with cold, their eyes faintly glowing in the stormy night. He had not invited anyone into his home for years, and now a group of strangers, aliens, no less, stood begging for shelter. The storm howled around them, yet their silence pressed harder on his heart than the thunder above. Finally, Samuel moved aside, his voice gruff but steady. "Come in, before the storm drowns you," he said. The widows looked at one another, then stepped slowly forward, their wet cloaks dripping on the wooden floor as they crossed the threshold. Inside, the fire burned low, giving only faint warmth, but it was still better than the freezing rain outside. They gathered near the hearth, removing their hoods at last. Samuel studied them carefully. Their faces were thin, their cheeks hollow, their clothes worn and torn from travel, though each was different. Skin shades ranging from pale blue to soft gray, hair from silver strands to deep black braids. They all carried the same expression, a mixture of exhaustion and sorrow. The truth was clear before anyone spoke. These were women who had suffered greatly. One of them, the same who had first spoken at the gate, stepped forward. She was taller than the others, her silver eyes glowing like starlight in the dim room. Her voice was low, carrying both strength and weakness. "We are widows of the war," she said. "Our husbands were soldiers, taken from us by fire and steel." The other women lowered their heads, some clutching the edges of their cloaks, others pressing their hands together as if in silent prayer. Samuel's chest tightened. The word war echoed in his ears, awakening old memories of battles he had fought long ago. He had seen loss. He had seen the broken families left behind, but never this close, never in his own home. He sat down in his chair slowly, his eyes never leaving theirs. "Why here?" he asked. "There are towns, cities, refugee camps. Why come to my ranch?" The tall widow hesitated, then lowered her gaze. "Because no one else would take us," she whispered. Her words struck Samuel harder than any bullet. She continued, "We tried the camps, the outposts, the villages, but they turned us away. 11 widows traveling together are seen as a burden. Some fear us, some mock us, some think we bring misfortune." Her voice shook for the first time, and Samuel realized the courage it took for her to speak. Another widow, smaller, with soft gray skin and dark eyes, stepped forward. She held her hands tightly against her chest. "They chase us," she said quietly. "Raiders. They hunt widows, they see us as weak, easy to take. We fled, but we cannot run forever." Her voice cracked, and she looked at Samuel with pleading eyes. "Please, old one, give us shelter. Just for a time." The room grew heavy with silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the storm outside. Samuel rubbed his weathered face, his heart torn. He had wanted solitude, peace in his final years, nothing more than the quiet life of his ranch. But here in his living room stood 11 women with no place to go. Hunted, broken, and desperate, he could not simply turn them away, yet he feared what their presence would bring. He looked at their hands, scarred from work, at their tired eyes, at the way they leaned on one another for strength. They were not weak, not helpless. They had walked through storms and fire to reach him. They had carried grief heavier than the rain outside. And still they stood, still they begged for life. Samuel's voice was rough when he spoke again. "You want to stay here on my ranch? Do you know what you ask?" The tall widow lifted her eyes, silver light shining through the dimness. "We ask for a roof, for safety, for a place where we can breathe without fear," she said. Her words cut straight through Samuel's walls he had built for years to keep himself alone. He felt something stirring inside, something long buried, compassion, duty, maybe even the ghost of the soldier he once was. The storm outside raged on, lightning splitting the sky, but inside, the fire grew warmer, brighter, as if the house itself knew change had come. Samuel leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, staring at the women who had turned his quiet night upside down. Their plea was not just for shelter, it was for survival, for dignity, for a chance to live without fear. And in their eyes, he saw the reflection of his own past, moments when he too had needed someone to stand by him. Finally, Samuel gave a slow nod. "You can stay for now," he said. "But this ranch is not easy. You will work, you will learn. If you accept that, then you may find safety here." For the first time since they entered, a faint light appeared in the widow's tired eyes. They bowed their heads in gratitude, their whispers of thanks filling the silent house. Samuel sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of what he had just agreed to. He knew his life of solitude was gone, replaced by something uncertain, something dangerous perhaps, but also maybe something worth living for again. The widows had pleaded, and he had answered, and deep inside he knew that this was only the beginning. Morning came slowly on the ranch. The storm had passed, leaving behind wet soil and a sky washed clean. Sunlight poured over the fields, glistening on the grass, and the air smelled fresh and new. Samuel rose early, as he always did, and stepped outside with his hat pulled low. But this morning was different, for he was no longer alone. The 11 widows followed him quietly, their cloaks still damp from the storm. They looked around the wide ranch with curiosity and uncertainty. For years they had wandered from place to place, never allowed to stay, never allowed to belong. Now they stood on land that might finally be their refuge. But they were strangers to this life, and Samuel could see it in their hesitant steps. He stopped by the barn, pointing at the wooden fence that leaned dangerously to one side. "If you want to stay here, you'll have to work," he said, his voice gruff. "This land gives nothing for free, and I cannot carry it alone anymore." The widows exchanged glances, then nodded silently. They were ready to do whatever was needed, for they had nowhere else to go. The day began with small lessons. Samuel showed them how to milk the cows, their laughter breaking out when the animals twitched at their clumsy hands. He taught them how to gather eggs from the hen house. Warning them to watch for the rooster's sharp beak, he handed them tools for mending fences. And though their fingers were slender and unused to human tools, they learned quickly. Every mistake brought giggles or frustrated sighs, yet with every attempt they grew steadier. Samuel, who had lived in silence for years, found himself listening to the sound of voices around him. The widows spoke in soft alien tongues among themselves, but they also practiced human words, repeating after Samuel with care. Their accents were strange, but their determination was strong. Soon the ranch was no longer quiet. It was filled with voices, with footsteps, with life. The emptiness that once haunted Samuel's days began to fade, replaced with something he had long forgotten. At mealtime, the widows gathered in the kitchen. Their cloaks hung to dry near the fire. They prepared food with what little Samuel had, mixing human grain with alien spices they carried in small pouches. The air filled with a scent both strange and comforting. For the first time in years, Samuel sat at his long wooden table not as one man eating alone, but surrounded by others. The widows ate slowly, their eyes soft, as if they too were rediscovering what it meant to share a meal in safety. One widow, the youngest of the group, asked Samuel about the land. Her voice was quiet, her skin pale blue, her hair like silver threads. "Why do you live alone?" she asked. Tilting her head, Samuel did not answer at once, his eyes drifting to the fields beyond the window. "Because peace is easier to keep when no one else is around," he finally said. But even as he spoke, he realized how empty those words had become. Later that afternoon, Samuel noticed one widow standing apart from the others. She was tall, with dark braids and golden eyes that reflected the sun. She was trying to lift a heavy sack of feed but struggled. Samuel walked over, ready to take it from her, but she shook her head firmly. "I must learn," she said, her voice steady. "We cannot depend on you for everything." Samuel watched as she tried again, her arms trembling until another widow rushed to help her. Together they carried the sack with laughter, their bond stronger than before. The ranch that once echoed only with wind and cattle now sang with voices. The widows planted seeds in the garden, repaired broken rails, and even chased chickens that escaped the coop. Each moment was clumsy, filled with mistakes. But Samuel saw something more. They were not just surviving, they were rebuilding themselves, piece by piece, and somehow he felt he was being rebuilt too. But not all was light as the sun set. Samuel noticed the eldest widow staring toward the hills, her silver eyes clouded with worry. "What is it?" he asked, stepping beside her. She hesitated, then whispered, "We have known too much loss. Peace feels fragile, like glass in the hand." Her words unsettled him, for he too had felt the shadow of danger since their arrival. Though the ranch was filled with new life, there was still something lurking in the distance, unseen but real. That night, as the widows slept under Samuel's roof, he sat awake by the fire. He listened to their soft breathing, their murmurs and dreams. His house, once silent, now alive with sound. And yet, beyond the walls, the wind carried whispers that reminded him of war, of enemies, of hunters who never gave up. The widows had brought light back into his life, but they had also brought shadows that waited at the edge of his land. Still, as he looked around the room, Samuel could not regret his choice. For the first time in many years, he felt like he was no longer just surviving. He was protecting, he was teaching, he was living again. The widows had pleaded for shelter, but unknowingly, they had given him something greater, and in that moment, Samuel promised himself that he would not let them be taken away. The days passed on the ranch, and life slowly settled into a rhythm. Samuel rose early each morning, the widows following him into the fields, their laughter and chatter echoing across the land. The silence that once weighed on the ranch had been replaced with warmth, with voices, with life. Yet beneath the surface of this new peace, Samuel felt an unease that refused to fade. It began with small things one morning. He found bootprints near the edge of his land, too fresh to belong to him or the widows. Another time, a fence post was broken clean in half. Though no storm had touched it, the cattle grew restless at night. Their cries carrying into the house, Samuel told himself it might be animals, wild beasts wandering from the hills. But deep down, his instincts told him otherwise. One evening, as the widows prepared supper, Samuel climbed the ridge that overlooked his ranch. The sun was setting, painting the land in red and gold. He scanned the horizon with narrowed eyes, his hand shading the glare. At first, he saw nothing but hills and empty plains, but then in the distance, he caught the glint of metal. It was faint, quick, like sunlight bouncing off steel. Too precise to be nature, too deliberate to be accident. Samuel's chest tightened. He knew what that glint meant. He had seen it before. During his soldiering years, it was the reflection of a scope. The eye of someone watching, he crouched low, his old instincts returning as naturally as breathing. The land looked empty again, but he knew better. Someone was out there, hidden, patient, waiting. When he returned to the house, the widows noticed the tension in his face. The eldest, with silver eyes, stepped forward. "What did you see?" she asked softly. Samuel shook his head, not wanting to worry them, but his silence was answer enough. Her eyes darkened and she whispered, "They have found us." The room grew heavy, their voices fading into fearful murmurs. The youngest widow clutched her cloak tightly, her pale hands trembling. Another pressed her forehead against the wall, her body shaking as memories of loss returned. Samuel stood in the center of the room watching them, feeling the weight of their fear pressing into him. He had seen soldiers break under fear, but these were not soldiers. They were survivors, tired and wounded. And still they stood together. That strength stirred something inside him, something protective, fierce and unyielding. The next morning, Samuel took his rifle from the rack above the fireplace. His hands were steady as he cleaned it, oiling the barrel, checking the scope. The widows watched in silence, the sound of metal clicking and cloth rubbing filling the room. They had seen weapons before, seen what they could do, but in Samuel's hands, the rifle was not just steel. It was a promise, a warning, a shield. "We will be ready," he said, his voice low but firm. The widows exchanged glances, unsure if he spoke to them or to himself. One of them, with golden eyes, stepped forward. "We will help," she said, her tone steady. "We may not know your ways, but we can fight. We cannot run forever." Samuel looked at her, at all of them, their faces lined with fear but also determination. He gave a slow nod. "If we stand together, we may hold this place," he said. The days that followed were filled with quiet preparations. Samuel walked the ranch with the widows, teaching them how to mend fences with purpose, not just for animals, but as barriers against men. He showed them how to dig shallow trenches, how to move silently, how to listen to the wind for sounds that did not belong. They listened, they learned, their clumsy hands growing steadier, their fearful eyes growing sharper. The ranch, once a place of peace, was slowly turning into a fortress. At night, Samuel sat awake by the fire, listening, always listening. Sometimes he thought he heard footsteps in the distance. Whispers carried on the wind. Once he saw a shadow move across the far hill, vanishing before he could raise his rifle. The widows slept lightly, their dreams haunted, often waking with soft cries. Samuel would sit near them, keeping watch until dawn, the firelight flickering across his weathered face. Though fear hung heavy in the air, something else grew alongside it. Trust. The widows began to look at Samuel not only as a protector but as a leader. And Samuel, though he had once sworn to live his last years in solitude, now found himself bound to these 11 lives. They had brought light to his empty ranch, and in return, he would not let shadows take them away. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Samuel stood at the edge of his porch, his rifle resting against the railing. The land stretched quiet before him, golden in the fading light, but he knew the peace was fragile, like glass ready to shatter somewhere out there. Eyes were watching, waiting. The storm of war was coming again, this time to his ranch, and Samuel swore to himself that if the shadows came closer, they would not leave alive. The morning sun rose over the hills, but Samuel felt no warmth in it. The air was heavy with tension, as if the land itself knew what was coming. He stood on the porch with his rifle slung over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the horizon. The widows gathered behind him, their faces pale but their backs straight. They were ready to listen, ready to act, because they knew the shadows had finally found them. Samuel cleared his throat, his voice firm. If you stay here, you will fight. This ranch is our home now, and no one will take it without cost. The widows exchanged glances, fear flashing in their eyes. But none turned away. They had run too long, they had lost too much, and they would not surrender again. Work began at once. Samuel led them into the barn. Pulling out tools, nails, and old coils of wire, he showed them how to sharpen wooden stakes and drive them into the ground along the fences. The widows' hands bled from splinters. But they did not stop each strike of the hammer. Each tightened wire was a vow of survival. They dug shallow trenches along the fields, their bodies bent and sweat running down their faces. Samuel taught them how to set traps, hidden snares in the tall grass where raiders might pass. The widows worked side by side, their alien voices mixing with human curses as they struggled with heavy earth. But with every shovelful of dirt they grew stronger, more determined. The ranch that had once been a place of quiet living was turning into a fortress under their hands. Inside the house, Samuel turned the kitchen into an armory. He laid out hunting knives, old pistols, and spare ammunition. The widows handled the weapons carefully, some trembling at the weight, others holding them as if remembering a time when they had defended their homes long ago. Samuel stood with them, showing how to hold the rifles, how to breathe before pulling the trigger. Their aim was poor, their hands unsteady, but their eyes burned with a fire that told him they would not break. At night, when the work was done, they sat around the fire. Their faces glowed in the flickering light, shadows dancing across the walls. The youngest widow whispered softly, her pale blue skin shining under the flame. "I used to sing to my children before they slept," she said, her voice trembling. "Now there are no children left, only us." The others bowed their heads. Silent in grief, Samuel clenched his jaw, his chest heavy. He had thought himself hardened to sorrow, but their pain cut through his armor like a blade. Yet even in grief there was strength. The widows rose each morning before the sun, working beside Samuel with fierce determination. They learned to herd the cattle in tighter circles, to use the barn as cover, to signal each other with simple hand signs Samuel taught them. What they lacked in experience, they made up for with unity. They had nothing left to lose, and that made them stronger than fear. One afternoon, as Samuel checked the far fence, he spotted movement in the hills, dark shapes shifting against the horizon. Too many to be animals, he raised his rifle, squinting through the scope. Figures on horseback, armed, watching, waiting. The raiders had come, but they were testing the ground before the strike. Samuel lowered his weapon slowly, his heart steady. They knew where the ranch was now, and it was only a matter of time before the attack came. That night he gathered the widows in the main room. The fire crackled, casting their faces in light and shadow. "They are close," Samuel said. "When they come, it will not be easy. Some of us may fall, but if we stand together, we may drive them away." The widows nodded. Their eyes filled not only with fear but with something more, resolve. The eldest widow stepped forward, her silver eyes shining. "We have lost everything already," she said. "If we die here, we die as more than widows, we die as fighters. We die as family." Her words rippled through the room like thunder. Samuel felt pride swell in his chest, pride he had not felt in years. For the first time since the war of his youth, he was not fighting alone. As dawn approached, the ranch stood ready. Fences lined with hidden stakes, trenches dug into the earth, weapons cleaned and loaded. The widow stood shoulder to shoulder with Samuel, their cloaks tied back, their eyes hard. The land was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Samuel took a deep breath, the weight of years pressing down on him. This was not the quiet retirement he had once imagined, but it was the battle he had been given, and for the first time he did not resent it. When the first howl echoed across the hills, the widows froze. Samuel raised his rifle and stepped to the front, his voice calm but strong. "They are here," he said. "Hold your ground." The widows tightened their grips on their weapons, their hearts pounding in unison. The shadows that had haunted them for so long were coming into the light, and this time they would not run. This time, they would fight. The first light of dawn stretched across the hills, painting the sky in pale gold. The ranch stood quiet, but it was not peace. It was the stillness before violence. Samuel stood at the porch with his rifle ready. His eyes sharp, his back straight. Beside him, the 11 widows took their places, their cloaks tied back, their hands steady on their weapons. They were no longer just refugees. They were defenders of this land. The howl came again, sharper, closer, followed by the pounding of hooves. Shadows appeared on the ridgeline, dark figures on horseback, their banners torn and their weapons gleaming. The raiders, cruel and hungry, had finally come to claim what they thought was theirs. They rode down the hill with wild shouts, their war cries splitting the morning air. Dust rose like smoke behind them as they charged toward the ranch. Samuel raised his rifle and fired, the crack of the shot echoing across the valley. One rider fell, his body tumbling into the dirt, the horse veering away. The widows flinched at the sound but held their ground. They had trained for this moment, and there was no turning back. "Steady," Samuel barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Wait for them to come closer." The raiders thundered forward, arrows and bullets flying through the air. The widows ducked behind fences and barrels as Samuel had taught them. Firing in bursts, their shots were clumsy at first, but desperation steadied their hands. One widow, with golden eyes, struck a rider clean from his saddle, her face fierce and unyielding. Another used her bow, loosing arrows with deadly accuracy learned from her own people's traditions. The battle spread across the ranch. The raiders tried to break through the fences but were met with sharpened stakes. Horses screamed as traps caught their legs, throwing riders to the ground. The widows rushed forward, knives flashing, their cries sharp with defiance. For so long they had run, but today they stood like warriors. Samuel moved through the chaos like a man reborn. His rifle cracked again and again, each shot precise, his body moving with the instincts of the soldier he once was. He shouted commands, guiding the widows, keeping them steady. For the first time in years, his blood surged with purpose, not for war, not for glory, but to protect the family fate had given him. A raider leapt the fence, landing inside the yard with a sword raised. Samuel turned too slow, his old body not as quick as it once was. But before the blade could fall, 2 widows sprang forward, one slashing at the raider's arm while the other struck him down with the butt of a rifle. They stood panting, blood on their hands, their eyes wide but burning with fire. Samuel met their gaze and gave a sharp nod. No words needed, only respect. The fight raged on, dust mixing with smoke as the sun climbed higher. The raiders had expected easy prey, but instead they found a fortress everywhere they turned. The widows resisted, pushing them back. Their unity was stronger than the raiders' greed, their desperation stronger than the enemy's hunger. And at the heart of it all was Samuel, the old soldier who refused to fall. But victory did not come without cost. One widow cried out as an arrow struck her shoulder, her blood soaking into her cloak. Another stumbled, a raider's blade cutting across her arm before she was pulled to safety. Samuel's heart burned at every cry, every wound. These women had already lost everything, and he would not let them lose more. At last Samuel saw their leader, a tall raider with cruel eyes and a scar down his cheek. He barked orders from horseback, driving his men forward with ruthless fury. Samuel raised his rifle, aimed, and fired. The shot struck the leader's shoulder. Spinning him in the saddle, the raider cursed, retreating back toward the ridge, his men hesitating without his command. The widows seized the moment, their cries rising as they surged forward, driving the raiders into confusion. Arrows whistled, bullets cracked, blades flashed. The raiders, once so certain of victory, now faltered under the resistance they had never expected. One by one they turned, retreating up the ridge, their shouts fading into the morning wind. The battle was not clean. It was not perfect, but it was theirs. Silence fell at last, broken only by the ragged breathing of Samuel and the widows. The ranch was scarred, fences broken, the ground littered with bodies, but it still stood, and so did they. The widows gathered together, some holding their wounds, others holding each other, tears mixed with sweat, relief mixed with exhaustion. For the first time they had not run. They had not been taken. They had fought and they had won. Samuel lowered his rifle slowly, his hands trembling not from fear but from the weight of it all. He looked at the widows, his companions, his family, and pride swelled in his chest. They had defended the ranch together, and in doing so, they had defended something greater. Not just a place, not just land, but hope. The shadows that had haunted them were driven back, and in the light of dawn, they stood as more than survivors. They stood as a family forged in fire. The battle was over, but the ranch still carried its scars. The fences lay broken in places, the earth torn with deep trenches, and the smell of smoke lingered in the air. The widows moved slowly across the yard, their bodies weary, their clothes torn, their hands stained with dirt and blood. Yet there was no despair in their eyes, only the quiet fire of victory. They had survived, and that truth alone gave them strength. Samuel stood in the center of it all, his rifle resting against the porch rail. His breath came heavy, his shoulders sagged with exhaustion, but his spirit burned stronger than ever. He watched as the widows tended to one another, wrapping wounds with strips of cloth, whispering comfort, sharing water. The sight filled him with a pride he had not felt in decades. These women, once broken by grief, had fought beside him as equals, and together they had defended the land. When the sun climbed higher, the widows gathered around Samuel, their silver, golden, and dark eyes all fixed on him. The eldest stepped forward, her voice steady despite her wounds. "We came here as beggars," she said softly. "We asked for a roof, for safety. But you gave us more than that." Samuel shook his head slowly. "No," he said, his voice rough. "You gave me more. You gave me back my life." The words hung in the air, heavier than any gunfire. For years, Samuel had lived alone, his heart buried in silence, but now, surrounded by these 11 women, he felt alive again. Not because of war, not because of duty, but because he had found family where he least expected it. In the days that followed, the ranch became something new. Together they rebuilt the fences, patched the walls, and buried the fallen raiders far from the land. The widows planted new seeds in the garden, their alien songs rising into the morning air. The cattle returned to the fields, calmer now, as if they too felt the change. The ranch, once lonely and silent, now pulsed with life. Samuel taught the widows how to repair roofs, drive nails, and care for the animals. They in turn shared their own knowledge, teaching him alien methods of healing and new ways to prepare food. Evenings were no longer spent in silence but around the fire. Stories passed from one voice to another. Some stories carried pain, memories of war and loss, but others carried laughter, small sparks of joy that had been hidden for years. For the first time in so long, the house felt like a home. One evening, as the stars lit the sky, the youngest widow sat beside Samuel on the porch. Her pale blue skin glowed softly in the starlight, her silver hair falling over her shoulders. "Do you ever regret letting us stay?" she asked gently. Samuel looked out across the land, the fields stretching wide under the night. "No," he said after a long silence. "I thought I wanted peace and solitude. But peace means nothing when you live it alone." Her eyes softened, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. In that small gesture, Samuel felt the truth. He was no longer alone. The widows began to call the ranch their sanctuary. Travelers who passed by whispered of the place where an old human and 11 alien widows lived as one family. Some called it strange, others called it impossible, but those who saw it with their own eyes spoke of unity, of strength, of a light shining in a world still scarred by war. And Samuel did not care what others thought, for he knew what it truly was, home. Weeks passed, and the seasons slowly shifted. The wounds of battle healed, both on the land and in their hearts. The widows no longer carried themselves as fugitives, but as women with purpose, with roots in the soil. They laughed louder, sang freely, and looked to the future with hope. Samuel too felt years fall from his shoulders, his step lighter, his voice stronger, his spirit no longer chained to loneliness. One night, as the fire burned low and the stars shone above, the eldest widow spoke again. "You gave us shelter when no one else would," she said, her silver eyes bright. "You are more than protector to us. You are family." The other widows nodded, their voices rising together. "Family," they said, the word carrying through the room like a vow. Samuel felt his chest tighten, his eyes stinging. He had not expected this, not in his final years, yet here it was, a gift greater than any medal he had ever won in war. The ranch, once a place of silence, had become a place of rebirth, where grief turned into strength, where loneliness turned into unity. And in the quiet moments, when the wind moved gently across the fields, Samuel would smile to himself, for he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. No longer a soldier alone, no longer widows adrift, but a family forged in struggle and bound by love.